see everybody. It's always a fun thing for me to see the crowd from literally the corners of the earth. It's the one thing that technology does really well, and I like that. So it's good to see you all. I know you can't see what I see, but I've got all of your pictures across the top of my screen, and I could just watch you all. It's a fun thing. Okay, we are in section 9. This is session number 9 of New Testament survey, and I'm beginning in the book of Luke today. The book of Luke is the third of the so-called synoptic gospels. As I've mentioned before, I believe Luke was the third of the gospels to be written. I think Luke was probably written roughly the same time as Mark was written. I think Matthew was written fairly early, and then Mark and Luke were written later. Mark was probably written from Rome. Luke, I think, was probably written, could have been written from Rome. Luke may have eventually gotten to Rome with Paul. It was certainly written before Paul's death, which would have been around 64 AD. So that's a time frame. The book of Luke is a synoptic. It means it's similar in its general outline and its storyline with the books of Matthew and Mark. Mark is the shortest, and both Matthew and Luke have a lot of the same elements as Mark. Matthew has some unique stuff, and Luke has some unique stuff. We're going to spend most of the lecture time with the material that is unique to Luke. And there are some things that Luke takes from Mark and Matthew, mostly from Mark, that he puts his own spin on. And I'll mention those as we get to them. Because it's fun having three separate authentic eyewitness accounts. That's always really helpful. If you go into court and you're trying to prove something, it's really nice to have several different independent eyewitnesses because they tell slightly different stories. They tell it like they actually saw it. And the end result is you get this three-dimensional stereo effect. I don't believe there are serious difficulties between the three gospels. Everything can be explained more or less by the effects of the different eyewitnesses. So we're going to begin. Let me see if I can share the screen here. Share screen, bingo. And here it comes. There we go. And that is operating correctly. Okay, the Gospel of Luke is the Gospel of Jesus as the ideal man. When we get into the Gospel of Luke, what we're looking at is the humanity of Jesus. And I seem to have lost my connection. Let's see if it's Zoom quit unexpectedly. Oh my, well, don't send. Join a meeting. Sorry about that. If you're still listening, I'm here. And for some reason, my Zoom meeting gave up. Oops, yep, there it is. Okay, maybe you're still listening and you're still out there. Let me look here.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Okay, I hear you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay, very good. I'm going to go on. Hope it doesn't do that to me again. That's the first time I've noticed that. Gospel of Luke, Jesus, the man, the man's man, the outdoorsman, the tough guy, but also the very genuinely human characteristics of Christ. Luke doesn't de-emphasize the deity of Christ or the kingship of Christ. Those elements, even the servantness of Christ, all of those things come out in Luke's gospel, but he puts an emphasis on the human dimension. That becomes important when we start doing theology and begin looking at, see, the long process in church history of deciding how to describe the relationship of the human and the divine in the second person of the Trinity. Luke plays into that. So, what do we know about Luke? There are a lot of things we'd like to know about Luke that we probably won't ever know until we get to heaven. We know that he was a Gentile, certainly not Jewish, and apparently not a convert to Judaism. He was a friend of Paul. We first see him in the biblical record in the book of Acts, and even there, it's difficult. In the middle of the book of Acts, as we see Paul getting ready to go to Europe, he has a vision of the man from Macedonia who says, "Come over here and help us." And after that time, there are passages in Acts that we call the we passages, where the author of the book says, and then we went from here to there to this other spot, and Paul did this and Paul did that, and then we went. So the author of the book is claiming to have been with Paul from about halfway through Paul's missionary career. Some have argued that Luke has to therefore be a Greek and from Macedonia. Not necessarily, although that's a possibility. Clearly, he's a friend of the Apostle Paul. Traditionally, Luke came from Antioch in Syria, but that's not a very well respected tradition. So what we have to say is we don't know when Luke did what he did. Luke does claim to be a historian. If you look carefully at his work, you will see all of the earmarks of a professional historian. He is well acquainted with other resources, other works by other scholars. He has consulted with eyewitnesses, in other words, primary sources. He has attempted to set up an orderly account of all of the things. When we dig through the Gospel of Luke, one of the things that we will notice is his attention to details that historians tend to notice, locations of places, and particularly the political affiliation of places. Particularly when we get to the book of Acts, we'll see Paul going from one place to another, and the particular Roman provinces, and who was the governor, and who was the proconsul, and who was the non-historians don't care, and most of the time it really doesn't matter. That's detail you can just go right past. But historians care about those things because they recognize that accuracy with trivial details is what makes a history authentic. If you can't get the trivial details right, how is anyone to know that you've got any of the important details right? And historians think that way. And Luke definitely had that. He did that. Luke cares about dates. He tends to date things in terms of the Roman regime. So in such and such a year of Augustus Caesar. Okay, that's helpful because we can then take that chronological data and plug it into a larger framework of Roman history. And it actually is a very helpful thing. And also, Luke is careful to make notes about most of the time who he's talking to and where his sources are. It's interesting that he obviously spent significant time with Mary, Jesus' mom. It's the only way that some of these stories could have gotten to him. He obviously spent a lot of time with Paul, and so Paul's firsthand accounts are there. But he also went to many other places, trying to figure out where he was and how he got his material is an interesting subcategory of New Testament scholarship. So there's a whole group of New Testament scholars that we call Lucan specialists. Between the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, the Luke material accounts for roughly 28%, a bit more than a quarter of the New Testament is Luke. Most of the epistles are written by Paul. So between Luke and Paul, we've got a lot of material in the New Testament that is all coming from more or less the same point of view. Okay, so Luke definitely had a lot of eyewitness testimony. The date, Luke has to have been written before the book of Acts. Because when he starts out the book of Acts, he says, in my previous document, I told you what started out. He's obviously describing the gospel. The book of Acts closes with Paul still alive in prison, and that would have been the easy imprisonment. So it has to be before 64 AD. A likely time frame is sometime between 60 and 64 AD. And unfortunately, Luke gives us no clues as to where he was when he wrote the gospel. It would be nice to know, but we don't know. Maybe I'll ask when I get to heaven. I may have bigger questions for other people by the time I get there. The purposes of the book. Number one, it says in the preamble, the first four verses, that he was trying to provide a confirmation of the faith to a character by the name of Theophilus. Now, Theophilus means friend of God or lover of God in Greek. And so some have said he wasn't really writing to anybody in particular. He was just writing to everybody who loves God. Problem with that is that the name Theophilus was actually a very common name in New Testament times. We have lots of examples of that name in the secular Greek literature. So it wouldn't be unusual at all for Luke to be writing to somebody actually named Theophilus. The second thing is that he calls him most honorable Theophilus. And that's a title that would be used for someone who is of some kind of political power. Perhaps a Roman authority, perhaps a Greek authority of some kind. Hard to know. But whoever this is, he's a believer. And Luke is writing the gospel to demonstrate the fact that the Christian faith rests on firm historical facts, more so than the other gospels, which are also presenting historical facts. Don't misunderstand me. But Luke is self-conscious about presenting a foundation of firm, reliable, broadly demonstrated by eyewitness testimony, historical facts. I've got some books here on my bookshelf about history, and the history books that I enjoy have lots and lots and lots of footnotes. Not because I always look at all of the footnotes, but I recognize that here's a historian who actually has taken the time to read the material and to interact with other people's eyewitness accounts, with people's objections to the eyewitness accounts, with other accounts that have tried to put it all together. A real historian is aware that he's presenting testimony that will be evaluated as to its truth content. So that's such an important idea. So to confirm the faith of Theophilus, to show that his faith rests on historical facts, I think that's foundational, and that's a very important thing that Luke does that the others don't do. Secondly, he presents Jesus as the Son of Man. The term Son of Man goes back to the Old Testament. There are several of the prophets use that phrase, particularly Ezekiel. And Son of Man, of course, is a term that emphasizes the humanness of a person. So you get John the Baptist. There was a man sent from God. Well, John the Baptist was completely human, and he happened to be sent by God. Jesus is also a man who happens to be also Son of God. So Jesus, the Son of Man, who also is the Son of God. Luke doesn't dispute that. He, in fact, is setting out to prove that. But the Son of Man is rejected by Israel and presented to the Gentiles. Remember, Luke is a Gentile, and he's the companion, the buddy of the Apostle Paul, who is preeminently the apostle to the Gentiles. So Luke and Paul are together on this. They are both enthusiastic pushers of the gospel for the Gentiles. So Luke wrote specifically to Gentiles. And again, when we walk through the book of Luke, the whole bunch of details, most of which I won't point out to you, but I'll mention it now, that demonstrate that Luke was not writing to Jews. He was writing to Gentiles. So when he comes up against a Jewish tradition that is a part of the storyline, he explains it. You wouldn't have to explain, say, the presentation of Jesus at the temple on the eighth day. It wouldn't be necessary. Because the Jews would know all about that. It happens every day. We all have gone through this hundreds of times. Everybody knows it. But the Gentiles would never have heard of such a thing. And so Luke explains the traditions. He locates places. He'll talk about such and such, which is alongside the Jordan, or which is next to Bethany, or on the way to such and such. because he doesn't assume that the people he's writing to are from Israel. Thirdly, he uses the Septuagint. Matthew and Mark, when they quote the Old Testament, often can be demonstrated to be using the Hebrew Bible. And what we're getting is a Greek translation of their Hebrew Bible. And it's somewhat different from the Septuagint, which was translated in Alexandria in Egypt 300 years earlier. And Luke extensively and exclusively uses the Septuagint, which was the Bible of the Gentile church. And then, very interestingly, Luke spends relatively little time with fulfilled prophecy. There are lots of things in the life of Christ that fulfill Old Testament prophecy, and we see a bunch of those in Luke. What Luke doesn't do is to specifically point out that this fulfills Isaiah, or this fulfills Zechariah, or this fulfills something. He doesn't usually mention that. Matthew does. Matthew is demonstrating to a Jewish audience that Jesus is the Messiah who was predicted by the prophets. For Luke, that's not the main thing. It's not the main issue. Jesus is, of course, the Messiah, but that's not the main issue for Luke. For Luke, Jesus is the Son of Man who is presented to the Gentiles as the Savior of the world. So, interesting book in that way, and we'll see a lot of those emphases as we work our way through. There's some special things that Luke does that the other Gospels don't do to such an extent. First of all, Luke emphasizes the universal nature of the gospel. This is the gospel for the whole world. This is the gospel that's going to be taken to the ends of the earth. This is the gospel for everybody, not just to the Jews, but to the Gentiles as well, and particularly to the Gentiles. Whenever there is a Gentile interacting with Jesus, there's an emphasis of the narrative. Secondly, as I mentioned before, Luke is a historian, so he puts a focus on historical details that the other writers just don't care much about. I guess I'm an amateur historian. I'm a professional historian in Old Testament times, but I guess I'm an amateur in other things. But I care a whole lot about trivial details that other people really don't care about. When I take people on trips, I'll show them piles of rocks that are very meaningful to me because it's a bit of trivial detail that supports a historical narrative that is important to me. And ordinary people just see another pile of rocks. And I understand that. Luke was concerned with each and every rock in the pile. And on that level, Luke and I will understand each other very well in heaven. We'll go off in a corner with our coffee and have long conversations about technical details that everybody else will ignore. He and I will understand. It's just the way it is. But you'll notice that in the Gospel of Luke, lots of stuff in there. Thirdly, Luke puts an emphasis on forgiveness. He seems to have come to Christ somewhat later than the others. It's possible that Paul led him to Christ, and it seems like he never got over the fact that he'd been forgiven of his sin. And Luke takes seriously the experience of the forgiveness of sin that happens in the lives of so many people who come in contact with Jesus. So it's something that we'll run into very, very frequently all through the book. Fourthly, there's an emphasis on prayer. Luke picks up on virtually every time that Jesus prayed. He actually includes details of Jesus' prayers. He thinks through the context and the purposes, and we see Luke more interested in prayer than the others seem to be in their books. Fifthly, Luke puts an emphasis on individual rather than corporate salvation. Now, I believe the New Testament teaches individual salvation. I think it's actually really important that the New Testament teaches individual salvation. What is interesting about Luke is that he makes this almost a hobby horse. This is Luke's own special emphasis, and he particularly relishes the unique circumstances of each individual who is called into a saving relationship with Christ. And so you get Zacchaeus and blind Bartimaeus and miscellaneous others, this woman and that one, and the individual circumstances and how God individually, uniquely calls them to Christ. There is a broad theme in some corners of New Testament studies that argues that the salvation that Jesus was offering is a corporate salvation, that is a group salvation. So there is salvation for the Jews, and there is salvation for the Gentiles, and all of the Gentiles simultaneously receive this gift of salvation. And you enjoy the blessings of salvation by joining the church and doing good things, but everybody's saved. And I have a big problem with that. And particularly, do I have a big problem with that idea when we're trying to work through the Gospel of Luke? Because Luke pushes hard the concept of individual rather than corporate salvation. We're going to see this all the way through Gospel of Luke and then into the book of Acts, as it's a consistent emphasis. And then the last one I have here, and I'm going to add one more, the joy that accompanies salvation. Very frequently, we'll get a note in Luke that so and so was delivered from demons, or made clean from leprosy, or stood up and walked, and he went away rejoicing. The other Gospels sometimes mention that and sometimes don't, but Luke never misses it. He always, if he talked to these people, it seems like he must have been asking them, and how did that make you feel? And when this happened to you, was that a good thing? How did that make you feel? And the guy said, well, I was really happy about that. Good. I like that. And so Luke writes it down. It's as though that is going on. A seventh thing that I don't have on this note that we should include in Luke's special emphases is the Holy Spirit. The Spirit of God plays a bigger role in Luke's gospel than in the others. The others don't ignore the Spirit, but Luke seems to never miss a chance, especially as we get into the book of Acts. Luke seems to relish the mystery of the Holy Spirit. I'm not sure any of us completely understand the Holy Spirit or our relationship to him. And Luke doesn't understand any better than we do, but he seems to enjoy that. There's a mystical characteristic to Luke that I think we sometimes miss. Anyway, that's the seventh. Let's get directly into the gospel. That's the quickest I've ever done an introduction to a book like that. Let's look at this first line. The background image is a Greek papyrus that comes from the Gospel of Luke from the 4th century, but is not Luke 1:1-4. I wish it was. That would be kind of fun. I think it's chapter 22, as I recall, but it's close enough for all practical work. Okay, so let me read the whole section from my Bible. Verses 3 and 4 are important. That's what I put here on the page. But the whole 4 verses are important. Inasmuch, one of the big old 5-syllable words that only lawyers use. Luke was not a lawyer, but he maybe would have been a good one. Some people have said, well, some people, the most important one being the Apostle Paul, have noted that Luke was a doctor. And we see some evidence of Luke's doctorhood. One of those is that he tends to have a fairly highfalutin vocabulary. And in the Greek version of Luke, both Luke and Acts are complex Greek. And the English, and I'm assuming all the other languages, are going to reflect some of the complexity, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. Oh, yes, to write an orderly account for you. So let's take this apart in just a little bit. The first thing to notice is that many have undertaken to compile a narrative. Of what? Of the things that have recently been accomplished among us. Luke is talking about the contents of the gospel, the life of Christ, the miracles of Christ, the death, the resurrection of Christ, the birth accounts. He's saying there are a lot of accounts. Many have undertaken to compile a narrative. And it is very likely that there were more than 4 gospels by the time it was all said and done. There were probably dozens of short excerpts. People would have written the account of the Palm Sunday and Passion Week, eyewitness accounts, and talk to people. There would have been accounts of the miracles in Capernaum. There would have been lots and lots of different eyewitness accounts of the life of Christ. And Luke has looked at those. He is aware of them. He knows that they're out there. The danger with well, how to say this? When something popular has happened, when Jesus came, he died, and then he was raised again. That's quite an amazing thing, and nobody could deny that. And suddenly, this was really a big deal. Jesus is alive from the dead. We're planting the church. We're worshiping the risen Savior. Meet us on Sundays, and people are saying, "Wow, this is really something." Does anybody know anything more about this? And so there would be a market for accounts of what had happened. In that kind of environment, it would be normal, natural, expected that people would write somewhat fanciful accounts. They would add things that might enhance the story, make it more interesting. Preachers all know the temptation to expand on the story just a little bit to make it fit better with what they're trying to prove. And those of you who are preachers, I mean no offense, I'm a preacher too, and I know the temptation. And we always have to be careful with that. Luke was aware of that. I think one of the reasons that Luke is so careful with dates and places and sources and the chronological order and all of the rest of it is that he was well acquainted with all of the other attempts that had been made at writing an orderly account. And others had fallen short. He's not competing so much as trying to produce what we today would call a magisterial account. There are on lots of things. I'm looking over at my bookshelf now. For the Middle Ages, there are dozens of what we call popular histories. I'm looking at looking at one right now on the assassins. Very interesting story, and most of it is not true, but that doesn't make it less interesting. It's a group that probably never existed, who are supposed to have done a bunch of really horrendous, adventuresome, terrible, awful things. And what I have on my shelf there is a compilation of all of the mythology that raised up about this medieval group of assassins. A real historian will be aware that those accounts are out there and will take the time to look up all the primary sources and write an orderly, accurate, sober account of what really happened. And that's what Luke is doing here. He said, enthusiastic Christians have written a lot of things, most of which are fairly accurate, but I want to write something down that really is. So I know that others things are out there. Many have undertaken to compile a narrative. And just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. Okay, this is a specific group of writers. And by this time, there were those amongst the apostolic band. These are the eyewitnesses and the ministers among us. Think about this. The apostles were particularly chosen. Each of the Gospels mentions that the apostles were chosen very early in the earthly ministry of Christ to accompany him and to be eyewitnesses. In the first letter of John, is it John or Peter? Anyway, both of them have much the same thing to say. These are things that we have handled and touched and seen, that our ears have heard, that we were eyewitnesses to. And that was a big part of the point of calling the apostles. So we've got eyewitness accounts who from the very beginning were there and had seen this, and they delivered this story to us. The primary job of the apostles was to deliver an eyewitness account of the events of the life of Christ and the teachings of Christ to the young church. And that they did throughout the rest of the first century, up until the death of the Apostle John in the 90s. The living apostles were responsible for authoritatively planting the church. Okay, and it seemed good to me also, having followed all these things closely for some time, to write an orderly account for you. Okay, there's the historian. It says, I've been studying this. This is a hobby of mine. I've listened to the various tales and accounts, and I've interviewed eyewitnesses. I've spoken to those who have firsthand knowledge, and now I'm writing an orderly account. The word orderly there means well proven, authoritative, chronologically in the right order, uh, uh, accurate as to quotations. This is the historian speaking. Most excellent Theophilus, of course, has to be the recipient of this book. And he's somebody important. He's a judge or a county clerk or something. He's important. In order that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So Theophilus is a believer, and he has been well taught, perhaps even by an apostle. And the point of the gospel here is to provide authoritative historical certainty concerning these things. This is a very emphatic statement. This is the historian putting down his marker. I'm going to give you something you can take to the bank. This is evidence that will stand up in court. This is like a signed affidavit. It says, I'm writing this in front of witnesses, and if I'm lying, you can put me in jail. This is the truth as far as I am able to discern it. And if I'm not sure, I'm going to tell you. So you can have certainty. So I like that. I like what's going on with all of this. Okay. The next slide gets us into the birth narrative of Christ. Now, Luke has the longest story of the nativity of any of the gospel writers. Matthew has a pretty good one, but you'll remember Matthew starts out with a genealogy because we're talking about the king here, so it's really important that we trace the genealogy back through David to Abraham. Luke is going to go elsewhere, and he doesn't begin with the genealogy. He begins with some very human things. It's going to start off with John the Baptist rather than with Jesus. Although by the time we get there, the nativity story in Luke is the most intimate, the most detailed, the most colorful nativity story that we have of Christ. This is because Luke took the time to sit down with Mary. And he asked questions, and he followed up, and he tracked down other eyewitnesses to these things, and came back and asked Mary some more questions and cross-examined her. And they must have had a great time. Mary would go make tea, and they'd sit down in the living room and talk about this stuff. Maybe that happened in Ephesus. It's a possibility. Some have suggested that it happened in Caesarea. I think Mary was already in Ephesus fairly early on with the Apostle John. Wherever, Luke spent quite a bit of time with Mary and really heard some stories from an insider's point of view. So we're going to start off the story. We'll look at the announcements of the births, and then we'll get the births and boyhoods, both John and Jesus. John the Baptist and Jesus kind of come in and out of this. So let's start out with Zechariah and Elizabeth. That came about in the days of Herod, king of Judea. You notice that the Gentile king, Herod, king of Judea. This would be Herod the Great. And he was a king really in name only. The Romans were in charge of Judea by this time. The Romans were more than happy to have a client named Herod. Herod was an Idumean or Edomite, and generally was broadly disliked by the Jewish people. And so he built a temple for them. Herod was a great builder, and the expansion of the second temple under Herod is famous. So in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. Now, how many of us today care whether Zechariah was of the division of Abijah or of some other division? Who even cares whether there were any divisions? I mean, seriously, I don't care. But again, this is Luke, and Luke says here that this is Zechariah, who happens to have been of the division of Abijah. Well, why does he add that? Well, because that's the truth. That is precisely what his scholarly research demonstrates. This is Luke. After a while, you get used to this. I won't point it out every time we see it. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Now, apparently, Zechariah was not a high priest. He wasn't in the Aaronic line, but he happened to marry a wife from the Aaronic line, which is a really big deal. Not everybody was of the lineage of Aaron, the priest. And her name was Elizabeth. So we've got Zechariah and Elizabeth. And we don't know a whole lot about them. They were of an age that Zechariah could be serving in the temple. They were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and the statutes of the Lord. These are some technical terms. The term righteous here and the term walking blamelessly uh, refers to Jewish people who were trying to keep the law. And they were trying to keep the law out of respect for God, whom they loved. There's a difference between trying to keep the law because you hope it will get you to heaven and keeping the law because you appreciate the fact that you're on your way to heaven and you love the God who has saved you. Zechariah and Elizabeth were godly people by faith. And because of their faith, they chose to live righteously and they chose to walk blamelessly. Now, I don't think either Zechariah or Elizabeth would claim sinless perfection, and that's not what Luke is telling us. He's using technical terms that would be well understood by the Jews of this time. Said here are some people who were serious Jews, but they were serious Jews because they had long since trusted God. They were godly people. And then in verse 7, but they had no child because Elizabeth was barren and both were advanced in years. In other words, they were old enough that, like with Abraham and Sarah, it was unlikely that there were going to be any children. All of us go through that. If you don't have children by the time you're a certain age, it starts getting unlikely. Stuff that used to work doesn't anymore, and we give up on having a family. And they had had no child. Elizabeth was barren, and they had obviously given up. It's interesting that we get this theme again. The importance of the family, the importance of children, the importance of the biblical term is the godly seed in the whole biblical narrative. Starting with Adam and Eve and running on through, we see this movement, a kind of a silver thread that runs all the way through. The fact that Elizabeth could have no children is a common theme in the Bible. And God's miraculous intervention is going to make all the difference. So the story is going to go on. I'm going to pick out a few more things. He was serving as priest while his division was on duty according to the custom of the priesthood. This is verse 9. He was chosen to enter the temple of the Lord and to burn incense. The altar of incense is right before the veil that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Burning incense is something that happened one time a day, and it was there were so many priests. They were chosen by lot to do this thing, and by division and by family and by the rest. And it is very likely that Zechariah's time to go in and burn incense was a once in a lifetime event. We sometimes think, oh, they burned incense all the time. Not so much. Once a day, the incense was taken in. Now, incense in biblical times was symbolic of prayer. So the altar of incense was symbolic of the constant access that the believer has to God through prayer. And you'll notice that Matthew and Mark don't mention anything about that, but Luke does. He never misses a chance to point out something that has to do with prayer. Well, it goes on. There he was, and the whole multitude of the people were outside praying at the hour of incense, and there appeared to him an angel of the Lord. So he went in by himself, and there's a big crowd outside, because every day the hour of prayer is a big deal. Okay, and so in he goes, and an angel appeared to him, standing on the right side of the altar of incense, and Zechariah was troubled, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." There it is. There's the promise. This is going to come full circle. You will have the joy and the gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink. He'll be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb, which is fascinating. And we're not going to go there. But there you can see a lot of the themes that are very common in Luke are coming together in John the Baptist. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and the power of Elijah. Luke says the spirit and the power of Elijah. He does not say that John the Baptist is the reincarnation of Elijah. The Old Testament seems to suggest that there will be one very much like Elijah who will come. And Luke is picking up on that. And he's careful to say John the Baptist is John. He is not Elijah, but he's very much in the spirit and power of Elijah. So he picks up where the Old Testament prophets left off. He's going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people who are prepared. That's verse 17. I think your verse numbers must be bigger than mine. Maybe it's my eyeballs that are not quite as sharp. But in verse 17, the job of John the Baptist was to identify a people who are ready for the coming of the Messiah. So Zechariah said to the angel, "How can I know this? I'm an old man. My wife is advanced in years." That's just reasonable. And the angel answers, I suspect, kindly but sharply. The angel probably got this all the time. You know, every time Gabriel came to tell somebody that something big was about to happen, we get the same kind of reaction. It's like when the angels talk to Abraham, saying, "You know, we'll be back next year, and your wife will have a son." And Sarah laughed. I think these guys kind of got used to that. Maybe one of those was Gabriel. Who knows? He's probably had a long career by this time, and is used to people not quite taking him seriously. And the angel answered him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God." You know, do, do not take me lightly, Zechariah. It's just interesting. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. I wonder how Zechariah was supposed to have known. I suspect that Gabriel was a fairly impressive character, and it must have been absolutely obvious that he was a supernatural being with an awful lot of authority. Nevertheless, he says, in effect, do you realize who you're talking to, young man? I'm Gabriel. Behold, you're going to be silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place. Now, I don't take this as punishment. I take this as a sign. Just so you need some proof, Zechariah. I understand that. I'm used to that. So here's how you will know. You're going to be completely unable to speak until all these things have been fulfilled, because you didn't believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. These words have come directly from God the Father, from the throne of heaven. And I was just there, and I've come directly to you with this message. You're a little hesitant to believe this, but this will happen. You can take this to the bank. And so you'll know, as of this instant, you're not going to be able to speak a word. Get used to writing on a blackboard, because you're going to forget how to talk for a bit. And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay. This is verse 21. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. And they realized that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them, which must have been fun. I mean, how would you, uh, how would you do a, what do you call it when you're playing that silly game where you charades? How would you do a charade? Is that what they call that, charades? Where you're trying to make a pantomime, and people guess what you're trying to make. So he was unable to speak, and he kept making signs. And when his time of service was ended, he went home. And after these days, what a uh, what a gentle way of describing this. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived. And they must both have been very surprised. They both, Zechariah says, I'm an old man. My wife is advanced in years, which is a nice way of saying my wife is old too. This is not something that is likely. And yet they went home. Zechariah explained, I imagine, with his blackboard, what was going to come to pass. And Elizabeth cooperated, and they tried to remember old times, and lo and behold, she conceived. And it was probably later that month. She explained this to Zechariah, and you can imagine their excitement, their wonder, the joy. Again, the joy. I think this is very important. And after that time, for 5 months, she kept herself hidden, saying, Thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among the people. And so this miraculous conception of a baby who's going to be named John. This is going to be John the Baptist. Great story. This is a story that that Elizabeth undoubtedly told to Mary, and Mary would have told to Luke. That's where we'll quit for the day. We're going to be back with the announcement to Mary next week. I suspect we'll be in the birth narrative, this whole nativity narrative, because it's unique to Luke. We'll be in this most of our time leading up to Christmas. This is what we celebrate every year. We celebrate Christmas because God became a man. And that is, all by itself, a very big deal. And Luke spreads out the wonder of it. That's the fun of the Gospel of Luke. We're going to come back on Wednesday and pick up where we left off. It probably won't be for another couple of weeks that we get through this and I begin picking up speed, but I never will pick up a whole lot of speed in the Gospel of Luke because, frankly, I really like the Gospel of Luke. You're going to tell that as we get farther along. Okay, let me unmute everybody. And let's see here. We need to, alas, it's time to say goodbye. And we appreciate, yeah, bye-bye. Bye, Don. Teresa, see Teresita, Christy, Joel. And there's, okay, the whole league crowd. And Oscar, Sally. Bye-bye, everybody. Love you guys. And we'll see you
Wednesday.
We'll see you next time. I wish I knew when we could come to Italy or the Philippines, but we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Thank you again.
Take
Bye.
care.